Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Billy Carson. I'm with University Conference Services. And before we get started, I'd like to give you some general information about this afternoon's presentation. First of all, we have a large audience, so we won't be able to open the lines for your questions. But you can type them in the questions pane, which is on the control panel on the right side of your screen. You might want to take a minute to see where that is. All questions are private. No one else can see them, so please feel free to ask as many questions as you like. Our speaker will answer your questions as time permits at the conclusion of the presentation. Second, you will receive a copy of the presentation via email from Mike and his organization. Next, if you are listening to the broadcast over your computer and you're having difficulty hearing, dial into the number listed in the audio pane in your control panel. That's also in the chat area if you can't find it in your audio pane. Finally, we are recording this broadcast and we'll make the link available via email. We'll also send out information on HRCI certification credit because I know that a lot of you are interested in that. Today's topic, retirement plan fees and how to determine their reasonableness, is the hottest issue in retirement plan sponsorship. The July 1 deadline for the 408B2 plan level fee disclosures is just a few days away, and soon after that, August 30, the participant level fees must be disclosed. Understanding the implications of these disclosures is vitally important. The presentation that you're about to hear is an excellent primer on this topic, and I think you'll be much better informed and able to understand the issues more completely by the end of the hour. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, my colleague Mike Falcone, who is the Director of the Eastern Region and Senior Plan Consultant for 401k Advisors. And I refer to him as a colleague because he has been such a frequent speaker at our conferences. At 401k Advisors, Mike provides consulting services for plan sponsors and their participants, and also serves as the project director for new and current clients. He has more than 25 years of focused experience in the qualified plan design, investment due diligence, funding, and participant communication. Formerly, Mike was a retirement plan consultant with Aon Consulting. He's a graduate of Drexel University, where he earned his BS in mathematics, I should say. He holds the Chartered Financial Consultant and Chartered Life Underwriter designations from the American College. He has also won industry recognition as one of the top 300 most influential advisors in defined contribution and is among the top 40 advisors in the large plan market. I know personally from the many years that Mike has spoken at our programs that he is widely respected and appreciated for his expertise and the professionalism he puts into his presentations. And now I'm going to turn things over to Mike. And Mike, I will be handing you the control, and you should be set to go.
Thank you, Billy, and good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to those on the West Coast. As Billy mentioned earlier, this is an extremely hot topic in the retirement arena right now. Fees, fee disclosure, reasonableness of fees. So we've got a very packed agenda, and what I thought I'd do is share with you what we're going to talk about in today's session. So, Billy, I'm having trouble advancing the slides. Oh, there you go. So the key agenda is why should you care about fees? So we're going to talk about fiduciaries and the responsibilities, go over the new disclosure regulations, share some information on a recent fee litigation case, then go through the economics of retirement plan fees, hopefully put you in a better position to understand what are all the components that go into retirement plan fees, and what's the real focus of the DOL as they're trying to monitor these fees, and then help you through a process and how you might be able to determine if your plan fees are reasonable. So we'll talk about the process itself and then share with you a case study. So just a basic industry snapshot. And again, these are rounded numbers, and of course the asset number changes daily with the way the market's behaving. But in general, there's about 500,000 participant-directed individual account plans, representing about $5 trillion in total plan assets. And these plans generate roughly $50 billion in annual fees. So that's an average expense of around 1% of plan assets. So that's the all-in cost for investments, advisory, administration, et cetera. The actual fees for any plan can range from 0.5% and possibly even lower for some of the largest plans to anywhere up to 2.5% and possibly higher if you've got a much smaller plan. So the key thing you need to know is, are these fees reasonable, and where do your plan fees fall? Okay, just a little information that's been distributed as part of a Deloitte study, and it had to do with plan sponsor knowledge of fees. Of a survey database, it was shown that roughly 19% of plan sponsors that have funds with revenue sharing don't know what proportion of their funds pay revenue sharing. Another 37.5% of the plan sponsors that credit revenue sharing back to plan participants don't know how this happens. 16% of the plan sponsors are uncertain if the plan offers an ERISA budget account, and 13% of plan sponsors don't know what types of fees are added to their company stock fund. So when it comes to fees, there are still a lot of plan sponsors that, whether they want to admit it or not, aren't totally comfortable with their knowledge of the fees and feeling comfortable enough that they're in a position to be able to demonstrate whether or not those fees are reasonable. So we'll talk about fiduciaries and their responsibilities, and I would guess that by virtue of being on this phone conversation today, that everyone on the call is a fiduciary, and it's important to know that there are several ways that the DOL looks at in determining whether or not you're a fiduciary. One is their strict definitions. You're a fiduciary if you exercise discretion and control over the plan management or the disposition of its assets, if you render investment advice for a fee, if you have authority over plan administration, if you're the named fiduciary in the plan document, and every plan is required to have a named fiduciary. More often than not, it's a company or maybe the plan administration committee, but sometimes it's actually an individual. So if you're not sure, I suggest you check your plan document and see what that says with regard to your committee. And it's really important to know that the DOL looks at this and doesn't care what your title is. They look at it by virtue of the functions you perform. And you could be an administrative assistant to the president, but if you're performing functions that give you discretion or control over how the plan is administered or how the assets are managed, you, by virtue of what you're doing, become a plan fiduciary. And as a plan fiduciary, it's important to know that there are certain responsibilities that go along with that. First and foremost, a fiduciary must act solely in the interest of the plan participants, the beneficiaries, and alternate payees. This is the exclusive benefit rule. And in doing so, you need to carry out your duties prudently. You need to follow the terms of the plan document, unless the documents are inconsistent with ERISA, diversify plan assets to minimize the risk of large losses, and also to pay only fair and reasonable expenses. Now, it's important, and we'll talk about a case later on where a plan document very much came into play with respect to litigation. Plan document is your plan document itself, your trust agreement, your summary plan description. If you have an executed investment policy statement, that is a document. If you've got a committee charter that you've executed, that's a plan document. So once these are executed, they're considered plan documents, and you have to operate your plan in accordance with the way it's written in those documents. And we'll see later on how that came back to bite a plan sponsor with respect to fees and fee litigation. So there are a couple components of fee disclosure going on right now. There's one, the 408B2 regulations deal with plan provider to plan sponsor disclosure. And the second piece that we're going to talk about in a little bit is the 404A5 regulations, which deal with plan provider / plan sponsor to plan participants. The first of these, the 408B2, again, it's plan provider to plan sponsor. It's called the Reasonable Contract Regulations. There's a section in the code 4046 of ERISA which lays out prohibited transactions. And there's a prohibition against parties of interest providing furnishings of services to a plan. However, there are exemptions from these prohibited transactions to the extent that the services provided are necessary for the establishment or operation of a plan. So if you think about it with respect to a 401k plan, you need somebody to administer that plan. So that party might be a party in interest and normally would be a prohibited transaction to pay that individual. But this is an exemption because those services are necessary to have the plan in operation. The contract itself must be reasonable, The compensation must be reasonable. And one key thing is the effective date. This has been going on for quite a few years now, and there have been several dates that were supposed to be anchors. Originally, these were supposed to be effective January 1st of this year. The DOL came along and pushed them back to April 1st, and with the final regulations, they're now effective July 1st. And anything with respect to these disclosure regulations, the notices must be distributed by August 30th of 2012. So if you haven't already received disclosures from your providers, and again, your providers are, it may be your actuary, it may be your auditor, your advisor, your record keeper administrator, your trustee, your custodian. All of these providers, to the extent that they receive payment from your plan, are required to put together disclosure information with respect to those payments. Okay, in terms of what falls under these disclosure regulations is any pension plan defined under ERISA 3-2-A. So it's basically, it's a defined benefit pension plan, it's a defined contribution, qualified defined contribution savings plan. It doesn't include simplified pensions or simple retirement accounts or IRAs. And the same rules apply for DB and DC plans. There's also a recent exemption that frozen 403B contracts are not subject to the new regulations. So who are the covered providers? The covered providers are those that enter into a contract arrangement with the covered plan, so we talked about who they might be. They provide services, and the regulations require anybody that receives compensation of at least $1,000 in direct compensation in connection with the provision of services to provide disclosure documentation to the plan sponsor. The rules require the disclosures to be in writing. However, the DOL did not come out with a formal contract. There just needs to be some description, and the notices must be provided in advance of the date the contract's entered into, extended, or renewed. So with this being the first disclosure notice, the effective date again is July 1st. Those notices need to be distributed by the end of August, and to the extent a provider makes any changes in the structure of those notices, they're required to provide you with new documentation. What should be included in the documentation is a description of the services, a description of the compensation, any termination compensation, description of the manner and receipt of compensation. So think of it as a buyer of services, a consumer of services from a provider. What you need to know is, what are you doing for me? How are you going to do it? How are you going to get paid? And what's that going to amount to? So it's really important that you understand with any provider that's out there what they're doing, how they're getting paid, what the dollar equivalent is. And at the end of the day, the DOL is going to expect that once you have this information in your hands, you're going to be in a position to determine whether or not these fees are reasonable. Okay, with respect to direct and indirect compensation, it's anything of monetary value. You can exclude any non-monetary compensation that's $250 or less. If there's indirect compensation, in other words, it might be a commission payment or it might be a bonus payment, an override payment, it must describe the relationship, the arrangement between the payer and the service provider. And if you're providing a bundled suite of services, there's no need to create an artificial allocation of all those component services. Okay, what happens if you don't get this information? Really, the onus is not on you as a plan sponsor. It's going to be on the provider. So as long as the provider acted in good faith and discloses the information as soon as practicable from the date of failure, there won't be a problem. However, if they don't, then there could be excise taxes, and it could have an impact on profits that may have been gained as a result of the lack or the delay in timing. So again, the burden is really not on you as a plan sponsor, as a plan fiduciary, as long as you can show that you did what you could to request the information from the provider that hasn't done it. And if the provider does refuse to provide the information, that you notify the DOL of the refusal or the failure to do so within 30 days. And then you notify the DOL again if they haven't effectuated a cure. So the only burden on you as a plan sponsor is basically to rat out your providers who haven't provided the information in a timely manner. So again, as a purchaser of services, I'd want to make sure I understood what I'm buying, what I'm getting in return, what I'm paying for that. And if I find that a provider is not willing or to tell me that, it might raise a few flags. So I would guess that for the most part, at least this first go round, everybody should be getting disclosure statements from their plan's providers. And we know that a bunch have gone out already. So the July 1st is really just the effective date. Some have gone out in advance. As long as they're in your hands by the 30th, then you should have what you need to carry out your role as a plan fiduciary. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about are the participant disclosure regulations. And again, this information is really designed to hopefully provide participants with sufficient information so they're in a better position to make informed investment decisions. So the plan administrator's responsibility is on a periodic basis provide participants and beneficiaries with the information regarding their rights and responsibilities with respect to the information. And what's included in that information with respect to plan-related information is information regarding the investment instructions. So if I were a plan participant and I wanted to move money from one fund to another, how can I do that? If I have stock or if I have voting rights as a result of owning shares of a mutual fund or whatever, how I go about exercising those rights. I also have to disclose what the designated investment alternatives are. So for most of the people on that phone, this would be your core lineup. It's a lineup you've chosen. You've gone through due diligence, selected funds in all different categories. You do ongoing monitoring of those funds. Those are your designated investment alternatives. To the extent you offer self-directed brokerage, and this is one area that's created a lot of concern recently, you have to make the information available with respect to what are the costs to have money invested in that particular option. You don't have to go through and provide descriptions and fees of every available option, but if I'm a participant, I just need to know what's it going to cost me to go through and invest through the self-directed brokerage window. What other fees might I incur along the way? To the extent participants are paying administrative fees, hard dollars, so let's say you're a plan and you've decided that your record keeper is charging X dollars, you're going to pass a portion of that on to participants. If that's a straight line deduction from their accounts, you need to disclose that. And you also need to disclose any individual expenses a participant might incur as a result of transacting business. So that might be if they want to take out a loan, is there an origination fee, is there an ongoing maintenance fee, is there a fee for withdrawals, terminations, etc. With respect to the investment-related information that needs to be provided, for each designated investment alternative, you've got to provide the name of the investment, what type of category, what type of fund it is, performance data, 1, 5, 10 years, versus a benchmark, same period, 1, 5, 10 years, fee and expense information, so what's the expense ratio of the fund, and what does that equate to per $1,000 invested. And then you've also got to provide an internet website address that would contain information related to that specific option. And also, finally, a glossary of the terms. Now, we've seen several of these notices. Even if you've got a plan with maybe 15 to 20 options in it, these notices can be as long as 8 to 10 pages long. We've got several clients that have many more than 15 to 20 options, and just the notices themselves can get upwards of 20, 30 pages. So there's a lot of information that's being given out to participants. Again, the idea is that they're going to be in a better position to make informed decisions. I think we're seeing a little bit otherwise. Anecdotally, what I'll share with you is that we've heard from one provider that has already distributed roughly 9 million notices to plan participants that they've only received 400 phone calls. with questions about what was included in those notices. Now, on the flip side, I think the other thing that you're going to see as well is a lot of information coming out, a lot of articles in the press, spotlight articles or news coverage on ABC. And just as, for instance, I received an email from a client that one of their participants was on ABC News and saw a brief little snippet about 401k plan fees titled 401k fee disclosure rules, is your plan a ripoff? So that participant got a copy of the article, sent it to the plan sponsor and said, what are you doing to protect my interests? So you can imagine there's going to be a lot more type of this information available in the press, on the TV, and the newspapers, and as a result, participants are going to ask a lot more questions than they ever have before. Okay, with respect to the timing of these notices, again, the first participant notice is annual disclosure notice. The first notice needs to go out. It's effective for plan years beginning after November 1st of 2011. The first notice is required to be effective as of 7/1 and needs to be distributed to plan participants no later than August 30th. And then on an ongoing basis, the information needs to be made available to participants as they enter the plan, and then annually. And to the extent you make changes, one of the things that DOL pulled back on a little bit was requirements with respect to changes. Initially, they were stating that any changes to the lineup, you'd have to go out with a new notice to everybody within 60 days of the change. What they backed off and said, you just need to do an annual notice. So again, we talked about effective dates. So the first annual disclosure notice, that's July 1st, no later than August 30th. The first quarterly disclosure, now this is more individualized to the participant. So the statements you would deliver, the online statements that you would post, effective with the quarter ending September 30th of this year, you're going to require, it's going to be required of you to provide more information with respect to fees. So to the extent a participant incurs a fee to do business in the plan, that information has to be disclosed in the reconciliation. So if you think about it, the way most statements work, they show you what's your beginning balance, what you put into the plan, what the company put in on your behalf, what the gains and losses were, what your ending balance was. Well, now there's going to be an additional item in there that's going to represent the cost for you to participate in the plan. So again, we're expecting that's going to raise a lot of questions from plan sponsors, from plan participants. These notices, the first disclosure notice with the new format, needs to be in place no later than November 14th of this year. So that's it with regard to fee disclosure. Again, the goal at the end of the day is really to make both the plan provider, the plan sponsor, the plan participant more upfront and aware of the fees that are being paid, the fees that are being assessed to operate, to participate in a 401k plan, so that ultimately everybody's a better consumer of services. I want to spend just a couple minutes on a recent fee litigation case that's gained a lot of notice and press, and that would be, again, I'm having a little trouble advancing the slides. Okay, it's Tussey versus ABB Fidelity. Now, Tussey was a very large plan, $1.3 billion plans. I'm sorry, ABB is a $1.3 billion plan. Tussey, the participant in the plan, sued both the plan provider and the plan sponsor. This was a court case that was held and ruled on in the District of Missouri. The ruling came down March 31st of this year, 81-page opinion. And it provides a very good roadmap on what the courts are looking at with respect to the fee issue. It's pretty obvious this is going to be appealed, but until then, it's the best case that we've seen on the subject and provides very good guidance on what to do and what not to do. So ABB was a sponsor of two defined contribution plans, a union and non-union plan. And within the collective bargaining agreement, there's a provision that said any administrative cost of the union plan which exceeded the cost of the non-union plan, would be paid for by ABB corporate out of corporate assets. Fidelity was the record keeper for both plans, and they also provided other services to ABB. Defined benefit administration, health and welfare administration, and payroll services. Mercer was hired along the way as an independent consultant to do an assessment of the fees. So what the finding was, sorry, having trouble with the slide again. Okay, the investment policy statement had written language in it that required the rebates, i.e. the revenue sharing, to be used to offset administrative costs. It also had a very strict process for selecting and deselecting investments. It also required the use of least expensive share classes and required the negotiation of the most favorable rates based on plan size and bargaining power. So these were hardwired into the investment policy statement. And if you recall earlier, one of the things I mentioned was that if you've got an investment policy statement that's been executed by the committee, they're required to follow the terms of that document, whether it's a violation of fiduciary responsibilities. So first issue was the failure to monitor. So there was no evidence that the plan fiduciaries, ABB, knew that Fidelity, what Fidelity was earning through the revenue sharing arrangement. There's also no evidence that the fiduciaries knew if their fees were reasonable. They never really conducted a market benchmark. When they did ask Mercer to come in and report on it, they basically ignored the findings of the Mercer report, which basically said you're paying too much. So even though they had information from an outside independent consultant that said your fees appear to be out of line with market, they did nothing as a result of that. The next issue was how they went about making a fund replacement. Within their plan, they had the Vanguard Wellington fund as a balanced option that was being used as QDIA, the Qualified Default Investment Alternative. They made a decision that they wanted to replace that and move to a target date fund series. Seems reasonable in light of that being probably a more appropriate option to handle the majority of the participants in the plan, but the way they went about it violated the policy again. One of the things in the policy had strict performance guidelines upon which this fund would be measured against, and the fund was blowing away its performance standards. It was outperforming the benchmark by significant amounts, so there wasn't really a performance reason why this fund should have been replaced. They also replaced this fund with funds that had higher expense ratios and had revenue sharing, so that the impact to ABB was more significant than what it was done for the plan participants. And they ended up replacing a good fund with poorer funds. So again, because there was strict wording within the investment policy statement and executed document, and they didn't follow that document, they violated fiduciary responsibilities. The next issue was they failed to negotiate rebates. So again, thinking back to the policy statement said you should be doing this, they took no steps to negotiate the best fees. If you think about it, with a $1.3 billion plan, you're in a pretty good position of negotiation with funds, with a fund manager, with a provider, to get really inexpensive funds or fees with very, very low investment management costs. So as a result, they violated the policy guidelines. They ignored Mercer's written report. Ultimately, what the court deemed was they seemed more concerned with saving the company money than with reducing plan fees to the participants. There was also an issue of float income. So float income is where Fidelity will capture the money and it may sit in an account, even if it's just overnight, before it gets invested and redistributed into participants' accounts. And sometimes, depending upon the volume of the money, it could generate a fair amount of interest. What Fidelity was doing with that float interest was using it, to pay the funds as opposed to helping offset plan expenses. Now, Fidelity has since, with all of their contracts, rewritten the way they handle float income. But at that point in time, it didn't work out to the benefit of the participants. So the violations for this particular plan were, one, failure to follow the plan documents, that written IPS, a conflict of interest. They were wearing their company hat when they should have been making fiduciary decisions. A prudence, a failure to monitor, to take into account relevant issues and document properly, and a failure to follow exclusive benefit rules. They didn't put the participants first. As a result, what happened was ABB was fined $13.4 million for the failure to monitor. They were also fined another $21.8 million for the improper mapping of the Wellington funds and the Freedom funds. And Fidelity was assessed a $1.7 million fine for improper use of the float income. So the takeaways of the plan sponsor, it's really important to make sure you have a prudent, a well-documented process to monitor plan expenses. Know what they are, benchmark them against the market, have and follow an ongoing process and document what you've done. Make sure that you avoid conflicts between the plan and the sponsor. So you've got to understand what the difference is between being a settlor and a fiduciary. Settlor is when you're wearing your business hat. Fiduciary is when you're wearing your fiduciary hat. When you've got that settlor hat on, you don't need to do what's in the best interest of the participants. You can do what's in the best interest of the company. But once you put that fiduciary hat on, it changes. You need to do what's in the best interest of the participants. Another key thing is don't use revenue generated from one plan to subsidize the company or its other employee benefit plans. So what you're going to see, if you've got multiple plans with a single provider now, you're probably going to see the providers coming back and saying, we need to price these out separately. To the extent you've got multiple types of plans with a plan provider, maybe you've got a DB plan and a DC plan. Plans need to be costed out separately. To the extent you're receiving other services from the plan, be aware that there's not excess revenue being generated from one plan or the other to provide you with subsidized corporate services. If you have a consultant and they deliver a report to you in writing, make sure you follow it. You act on it if it says you need to do something. And make sure your investment policy statement is not a straitjacket. I would say that in light of what we've seen in the market and the way investment policy statements are written nowadays, the policy statement that ABB was held to was very strict and really painted them into a corner when it really didn't need to. So it's important to review your policy statement, see how it's written, make sure it doesn't have language that can come back to haunt you. Conclusions, fee cases are here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. And I will tell you, it's only going to get worse over the next 6 months once these disclosures come out, because I can guarantee you there are people out there just waiting to see these notices and to see if they would break class actions and promote a lawsuit against plan sponsors. So how do you prepare for that? Know what you're paying, know what you're getting for it, make sure you have a process in place to monitor fees, make sure you follow it, and recognize there is no free lunch. Know how you're paying for these free services. So what we're going to do now, we're going to shift over and talk a little bit about how do plan providers work and what are the economics of plan fees, and how can you be in a better position as a plan sponsor to understand and be able to do all these things, document, benchmark, and have processes in place to make sure they stay in line. So if you think of it as a plan sponsor, as a purchaser of services for a defined contribution plan, these are really all the component pieces you're buying from your provider. First and foremost is record keeping and administration. There's compliance, so there's testing, it's 5,500, et cetera. There's investment management. There's communication. And then there's technology, both for you and your plan participants. All of these things come at a cost. And if you look at the components of cost of a plan, there are really 3 buckets that the cost will fall into. There are the investment fees, so it's all that associated with managing the investments. There's the administrative fees, so the fees associated with operating the plan, record keeping, trustee, compliance, communication, et cetera. And then there's plan advisory, plan consulting fees. So that might be what you pay your advisor, your broker, your auditor, your attorney, et cetera. Anybody that's providing service to the plan that's not your record keeper administrator or your investment manager. In general, the vast majority of plan costs are borne by participants through revenue sharing, and we'll share with you how that happens. The pricing for any individual plan is going to be a function of how much money you have, how many participants you have, What's the average account balance, and what are your service requirements? If you've got a very plain vanilla plan, one location, one payroll, nothing exotic about your plan design, it's going to be pretty simple. But if you've got non-publicly traded stock that's valued once a year, if you've got multiple locations, if you've got multiple payroll feeds, all of these things will impact your pricing. So it's really not fair to just go out and look at some booklet that says, hey, a plan with $20 million and 200 participants or 2,000 participants should be paying this much. The only true way to benchmark your plan is to go out to the market. And I would imagine that a good number of people on the phone do work with their health and benefit plans, and I would imagine it's pretty typical to go out and price your life and your dental and your ADD periodically, if not every year. You should be looking at the same thing with your 401k plan. So you don't necessarily need to benchmark it every year, but you need to have a process in place to be able to demonstrate that you've done it periodically. So when it comes to fees, here are the real considerations, and this is where you step back from being a plan fiduciary and you put that business hat on, and first and foremost, you want to get a good feel for what's it going to cost me to offer this plan with all those different components: investment management, administration, consulting services. And then figure out who's going to pay for it. Again, this is a business decision. I can set the plan fee structure up so that all I'm paying for is the advisor. I could set it up that I'm not paying anything and I'm passing all the costs on to the participants. Or I could set it up where all I'm asking the participants to do is pay for the investment management. So that is a business decision, and I have a right to do it any way I want. ERISA permits that. But it's important that you have an understanding and some kind of documentation that this is how the plan, the business has decided they want this plan paid for. Because once that decision is made, then effectuating it, carrying it out, and monitoring it become fiduciary functions. So again, who's going to pay for it? Business decision. How they're going to pay for it? Business as well. And there are really three ways to do it. You can have direct billed fees, you can have asset-based fees, you could have a per participant charge, and any combination of the three. So we talked earlier about this concept of revenue sharing. Revenue sharing basically is any fee above and beyond what an investment manager needs to manage the portfolio. So we'll show you a chart in a little bit that shows that there's an expense ratio of fund. A small component of that is really what goes to the manager. Everything else has to do with the operation of the fund. We would look at anything else doing with the operation of the fund as potential revenue sharing dollars. So let's take a look at that. So in a nutshell, if you look at the ball in the middle here as being the expense ratio of any given mutual fund, roughly half of that is going to go to the investment manager. Maybe more, it may be less, depending upon the type of fund, what the manager is investing in. But let's say this fund has an expense ratio of 1%. Roughly half of that, or 50 basis points, 0.5%, is what the manager needs to do his job. Now, a participant's always going to pay for the investment management fee. It's the other components, what pays for administration and record keeping, where revenue sharing starts to come into play. So there are really three basic components of revenue sharing available within a mutual fund environment. There are 12B1 fees, there are shareholder servicing fees, and there are sub-transfer agency fees. What a 12B1 fee is, what any of these are basically are fees that a fund company would incur if they were keeping the account of the plan for you as a retail investor to offer you statements, to phone lines, et cetera, and record keep, and basically provide you information about what you hold in that fund. When a fund has an arrangement with a record keeper, it's really a single relationship, and then the record keeper is the one that does all the underlying sub-accounting for all the people that hold the money in that particular fund. So in that relationship, that fund doesn't have to do all that work. What it will typically do is take any portion of these three components, the 12B1, the shareholder servicing, the sub-PA, and share all or a portion of them with that record keeper. So you'll see how that plays out when we do a fee disclosure illustration later. But for the most part, most funds that are retail funds out there have some component of revenue sharing that they will share with whoever is administering that fund on a record-keeping platform. And what that record keeper does is take that into consideration when they're figuring out what the net bill is they need to deliver to the plan sponsor. There's another important thing you need to understand is that a lot of mutual funds have varying share classes. And when you have a fund with varying share classes, the key thing to understand is that the fund is not managed any differently within each share class. It's the exact same fund with respect to the portfolio, how the manager buys and sells and manages the account. What differs is the expense structure of the different share classes and what portion of that is going as revenue sharing. So we'll share with you an illustration of the American Funds Growth Fund of America, a very popular fund. Right now they have 6 share classes that are available to investors in retirement plans, R1 through R6. Again, the fund is managed exactly the same regardless of the share class. But what is different is if you look at the far right-hand corner and you go down the expense ratio column, you'll see that that's what varies among the funds. So if I've got the R1 share class of this fund, my expense ratio as an individual participant, investor in that fund, is 1.43%. Of that, 1.05% is revenue sharing that's available to pay other people that work with this plan, the record keeper, the advisor, etc. And you can see how the share classes vary. The cheapest share class is the R6. So the R6 has an expense ratio of 0.33%. That's basically what the manager needs to run the fund, and very little more. In that share class, there's no revenue sharing available. So depending upon the structure of my fees and how I've decided to pay for plan services, I might use R6, I might use R4, I might use R3. What's important to understand is my choice of share class has a direct impact on the plan participant. Because if you start to look to the far left-hand corner and then track some of the returns, and let's go down the 1-year column. If I had the R1 share class, my return would have been 2.73% net of expenses. But if I had the R6 share class, it would have been 3.90. That's a significant difference. So choice of share class has a significant impact on what ends up in the participant's pockets. If you want to do what's best by the participants, you'll do the R6 share class. But more often than not, plan sponsors want to pass a portion of the record keeping and other expenses on to participants, and the way they do that is have funds that have some revenue sharing to cover those costs. So we'll look at a couple different models. So let's assume that all I wanted to do was have the participants pay the investment fees, and I, as a plan sponsor, going to pick up all the other fees. I'd use the R6 share class. No revenue sharing. Therefore, all I'm doing is cutting down and making the cheapest share class available. If I decided that I wanted to pass the administrative cost on, then I might have to use the R4 share class. Higher expense, but there's some revenue sharing that I'm using to offset those administrative fees. If I wanted to also cover plan consulting, advisory, audit, legal fees, I might use a more expensive share class because I'm going to need more revenue to cover those fees. So again, this goes back to having a philosophy in place on how you want the plan to pay for it, and then having a process to figure out how that's actually going to take place and how to monitor it. Where you get into problems with the DOL is if, let's say, you had the R3 share class, when you first implemented it, it was sufficient to cover all 3 categories of expenses. But let's say the plans had a significant run-up and the average balance has gone up 50%. Well, now there's much more coming out of this fund to cover all these fees. So participants are overpaying for these services. And that's what the real focus of the DOL is, and why they're placing such a big burden on plan sponsors to, one, understand the benchmark and make sure your fees are in line. So with that, let's talk about the process. Again, first and foremost, the participant, the fiduciary that is, must act solely in the interest of the plan participants, beneficiaries, and alternate payees to ensure that only fair and reasonable expenses are being paid. And in order to be able to document that you've done that, you should have a comprehensive, measurable documented process, done so with care, skill, prudence, and diligence that a prudent person familiar with such matters would exercise. This is also known as the prudent expert clause within ERISA. Basically what they're saying is if you don't have the expertise in-house to carry out a certain function, fiduciary function, then you're best served looking outside to somebody that does. So you may have the knowledge and wherewithal to do fee benchmarking on your own. If not, you should look to the outside and have somebody who's familiar with that do that for you. The process typically can be anywhere from a 6 to 8 week process. It's important that you gather information regarding your plan. You put together a document that says, here are the services that my incumbent provider is delivering. Take it to the market, look at other providers that might be similar or different, depending upon what you want to do. Get the information back, gather the results, look at the results, review them, and determine what course of action should be taken. So with regard to the information, it's really important you share plan demographics, how the money is allocated among the different investments in your plan. It's really important that if a provider is going to bid on your plan, they're going to want to know what the provisions of the plan look like. You want to make sure that you share with bidding providers what you're getting from your current provider. So if the current provider is doing 10 days of education, make sure you explicitly lay that out so everything can be on an apples basis. Also, you want to understand your current expense structure and articulate that. Again, if your goal is to set the fund lineup up such that it's going to cover all expenses, you're going to want to know what that fund lineup needs to be. More and more these days, the way record keepers and fee and investment benchmarkings are progressing is that a provider is asked to disclose what kind of money they need to administer the plan, absent any revenue sharing from the provider. So what you're basically doing is you're taking investments out of the picture and just saying, if I'm coming to you and asking you to deliver these services, what do I need to pay you? And it's a more reasonable way to put providers, again, on an apples-to-apples basis when it comes to determining cost of record keeping and administration. In terms of who you go to, you're obviously going to want to look at people that are financially strong, companies that have good retirement plan experience, that they're compatible with your plan. If you're a $10 million plan, you don't want to go to a provider that focuses on $500 million plans. You don't want to be a small fish in a big pond or a big fish in a small pond. So you want somebody that's got a good demographic fit, whether it's plan size, industry, et cetera, location. You'll also want somebody that has experience with any specific nuances of your plan. Again, if you're very plain vanilla, everybody out there can service your plan. If you've got company stock, it's non-publicly traded, it's only annually valued, there are a limited handful of people that can do that plan. And then what you're going to look at is delivery philosophy. And we really break that down into 3 components. So they're asset managers. So those would be the Fidelities, the Vanguard, the T. Rowe Prices of the world. They're the asset gatherers, more typically the insurance companies, Mass Mutual, Principal, Prudential, et cetera. And then you've got the open architecture firms. And open architecture really is where they don't specifically manage money, and they're willing to let you have access to any fund that's available out there. So it might be somebody like Charles Schwab or a Mercer, an Aon Hewitt, et cetera. What you're going to get from any one of these providers is really going to be a function of what you bring to the table in terms of assets. So when you look at the asset manager component, if you're a very small plan, you might only get proprietary funds. But as your plan increases in size, you might have access to more outside funds, maybe even separate accounts, et cetera. So it's really important you understand what the market is and who the players are that service your plan demographics. Here's what I was talking about earlier. This is, if you haven't seen something like this from your provider, I would ask for it because it's a really important document. And what it shows is it lists the assets by class, by the amount of money invested in the fund, by the fund itself, the expense ratio, that's what your participants are paying to invest in the fund. So if you look at this particular fund, it's a $20 million plan. The average expense ratio for the entire plan is 0.96%. You know, right around that 1% we talked about a little earlier. And then the gray shaded area really is important because that is what comes into play when you're trying to evaluate reasonableness of record-keeping fees. It's what portion of the expense ratio is available to that record keeper to be used to offset record-keeping and administrative fees. So in this first column, the expense ratio of this fund is 0.73%. 0.58% of that is revenue sharing, and that's generating $7,600. So all told, this fund lineup is generating about $138,000 of revenue. The provider's also got an asset charge of $21,000 and a bill fee of $10,000. These three components make up the cost of administration. So the 138, the 21, and the 10. That's roughly $170,000 is going towards covering the cost of administration. So your goal is, you may not know whether or not that's reasonable, but the goal is ultimately be able to say, okay, I went out to a couple other providers. I told them what my incumbent's doing for me. They've come back and said this is what they would do it for. And there are three things are going to happen. My fees are going to be out of line, they're going to be in line, they're going to be less expensive. More often than not, if you haven't done anything like this in the past 3 years, chances are they're going to be out of line with the market because a lot of things have happened. First and foremost, record keepers have become much more efficient. There's also a lot of price compression going on with the record-keeping fee market with all this disclosure. And what I'd share with you is and think about it in common sense perspective. If you're a homeowner and you've got a home loan interest rate of above 6%, and you haven't considered refinancing, you're probably crazy because you're leaving money off the table. And that's the same way it is with the market. So if you haven't looked at fees within the past 3 years or even beyond that, now is the most appropriate time to do that because I can pretty much guarantee you're going to find some inefficiencies in the structure of your current arrangement with your provider. And that's what the DO is expecting, that with all this information now, you're going to be in a position to say, yep, our fees are reasonable. The other thing to take into consideration, though, it's not just fees. Trouble advancing again.
Let's try this.
It's important you also take into account the investments as well. Fee benchmark in and of itself in a vacuum can be misleading. It's really important to take into account the investments. So what we've shown here is this is our process for evaluating funds on a 0 to 10 basis. 10 is the best. What we've identified is that we've got a fairly good lineup, averaging score of 9, but we've got one fund that's probably a problem child that we should probably look to maybe replace or take action on. So you're also going to give the bidding providers an opportunity to put forth their fund lineup. And it does two things. It shows you, one, what's available on their platform, what they think is the best fit based on what you have currently. But it also might represent opportunities for improvement. So you'll see that with a lot of these, it would be very hard for a bidding provider not to have a good scoring lineup. But what this has helped us do is recognize that, hey, there might be some better funds out there in certain categories that if we're going through this process, we might want to make fund changes. And in addition to tightening up the fees, maybe enhancing the lineup as well. So as you go through the process, it's going to put you in a position, one, to renegotiate fees to the extent that you see things are out of line. Look for opportunities to improve the fund lineup and identify potential service enhancements. One of the outcomes of an excess fee situation might be that maybe you go through this exercise and you realize you're paying X dollars above what the market says you need to, but you've got providers that you're paying with corporate assets, an advisor or an attorney. You might be able to say, well, let's use that excess. Let's keep the fund lineup, the structure the way it is, but now let's shift some of these costs from having to pay for it out of corporate assets to using plan assets to pay for it. Again, it's permissible on ERISA as long as they're ERISA permitted expenses. They're related to the operation and administration of the plan. And it's okay as long as you continue to monitor. the last thing we wanted to do, and I'll try to wrap this up in a couple minutes, is share with you a case study that we went through. So demographics of the plan, roughly 800 participants, a $50 million plan, so fairly rich plan, average balance above $60,000 per participant. They had 26 funds, including a managed account option. It was a safe harbor plan. The current service offerings were, everything was outsourced to the incumbent record keeper. They weren't doing anything in terms of education, advice, etc., just all the core record keeping services. The current expense structure was that there weren't any hard dollar billed fees. Everything was covered through fund revenue sharing. And when we did the reconciliation, that came out to roughly 53 basis points of revenue sharing. Of that, 16 basis points was going to the advisor, who was an employee of the incumbent provider. There was a $40,000 ERISA budget, roughly 8 basis points. And the remaining 29 basis points was going to the record keeper administration for record keeping administrative costs. A couple of things we found out were, one, the 16 basis points going to the incumbent provider was about $90,000, and based on some of the services that individual was providing, sort of seemed above market. Plus, there was a potential conflict because the individual was doing both plan and individual advisory service, but the advisory services were more focused on the C-level employees and the C-suites. The other thing was that the advisor was an employee of the record keeper, so there was potentially a bit of conflict there. With regard to the ERISA budget, while the company knew it existed, it never used the full budget. And the way the current contract was structured was that anything that wasn't spent went back to the record keeper. So in addition to the 29 basis points, they also kept whatever portion of the $40,000 that wasn't used. And then the 29 basis points itself was record keeping and administration. So what we found out through the benchmarking, our process were fourfold. So one, benchmarking for due diligence. They hadn't done this in a while, so they had no idea if their fee structure was competitive. They also wanted to, they've been with the incumbent provider for quite a long period of time, so they wanted to look at other providers to see, hey, has our provider kept pace with the market in terms of all the services that are now available? And then they also wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to potentially improve the lineup. So we went out to one asset gatherer, to one asset manager, and two of architecture firms. What we found out was, again, looking back at the plan costs were 98 basis points for this plan in total. The bidding providers came in at a range of 59 to 72. The average was 65. So some indication right there that costs were out of line with the market. When we broke it down and looked specifically at the net record-keeping cost per participant, that 29 basis points that the incumbent was keeping was the equivalent of $191 per participant. The range among the bidders was 86 to 150. The average was 114. So again, significant opportunity. At a minimum, we could chop 25% off the incumbent fees just to get them in line with the highest bidder. Our goal was more to get them in line with the average. And when we looked at the fund score, the current fund scores were doing reasonably well, but we had opportunities. So we also looked at, are there ways we can combine everything and improve the plan itself? So the outcome of this exercise, again, we went back to the incumbent. They decided not to move. They negotiated with the incumbent. And I would tell you most of the plan benchmarkings result in a renegotiation of the fees with the incumbent. The goal is not to move unless you find that the incumbent's not willing to negotiate with you, especially when your fees out of line. But what happened with this plan is we restructured the lineup. We were able to get many funds with lower price share class. So again, if you think back to that American funds illustration, we may have had the R3 share class. We were able to get either R4 or R5 now. We were able to then decrease the overall expense ratio from 98 basis points to 79. So that represented a soft dollar savings of about $100,000, all inuring to the benefit of participants. When we looked at the net record-keeping costs, the incumbent rebid the services and said, well, instead of 29, all we really need is 16. So just by putting this out to bid, the incumbent acknowledged that they were being overpaid, came back with a fee that was almost half the cost of what it was before. That resulted in $70,000 of savings. And again, because this was paid out of soft dollars, it was a benefit to the employees. And then we got the advisor to come back and reduce their fee to a fixed $50,000 fee, which represented a savings of about $30,000. We also restructured the ERISA budget so that to the extent there was any unused revenue sharing at the end of the year, we would create a process to put that money back into participants' pockets. So all in all, the net result of this is the participants really benefited significantly from this. Over $200,000 of soft dollar savings, but ultimately what that ended up allowing us to do is reduce the fund expenses, which ultimately ended up with an increase in the potential return on a lot of those funds, those same funds. So conclusions. Again, this is such a hot topic now with these disclosures going out. There are new disclosures, haven't been out before. Both you and your participants are going to receive these. There are going to be a lot of questions raised. There are going to be people out there looking to create a stir and hold your feet to the fire. So it's really important as a plan fiduciary, plan sponsor, that you have and you follow a process to understand, monitor, document your fees, your services, your investment opportunities. What we tell you is that general benchmarking of fees should take place annually. That doesn't mean going out to market. It just means let's have a gut check. Assuming we've done a fee benchmarking or market fee benchmarking, once we've done that, at least on an annual basis, let's just make sure we're staying in line. Doing a specific fee and investment benchmarking against the market should take place every 3 years. And the DOL sort of come out with that as a general guideline. So again, if you haven't done this in a while, now's the most appropriate time to do that. And do it in advance of anticipation of all these questions that are going to come up and potential DOL audits that are going to come down the road. With respect to a full RFP, full vendor RFP, obviously anytime you're uncertain or unhappy with what's being delivered, with your fee structure, the lineup, you might consider looking at alternative providers. I'd say as a minimum every 5 years is something you should do. Go to the market, actually bring in providers and interview them. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to change providers, but what it does do, it helps you have documented due diligence that you continue to look at the market and that you're continuing to try to find the best available services to offer to your participants so they manage their accounts appropriately and have enough money when they're ready to retire. This world's changing very significantly. Providers change, fee structures change, and being a plan fiduciary is not getting any easier, but the most important thing you can do, again, is have a process and document what you've done. Make sure if you're doing a fee benchmarking, you include analysis of the funds. They go hand in hand. Make sure that you're only getting full and transparent fee disclosures from all providers. Now that these regulations are out, the 408B2 regulations, plan provider to plan participant, we would hope that everybody that's a plan provider is acknowledging, accepting the responsibility, and being fully open about the fees they're collecting with respect to your plan. I would tell you that if you have any confusion whatsoever, or you feel like you're not getting that information, it's probably an indication that that provider is hiding something or that they're really not right for the market that you're in. Last and least, remember that all complex challenges have easy to understand wrong solutions. Again, don't just go to a book and try to figure out, I'm a $20 million plan, so my fees should be like this. Really, the only true way to be able to benchmark your plan and document that you've done it is to go to market and have other providers provide you with a quote on what they would charge you to deliver the same suite of services that your incumbent is providing. That's really the only true way you can do this. Again, nobody said it's easy being a fiduciary, but the more you work to have good processes in place, create best practices, not only you as a plan sponsor or plan fiduciary, but your employees are going to reap rewards for many years to come. And first and foremost, the DOL is going to look at you as somebody that's doing the job right, and that's somebody they need to be worried about. So with that, that concludes the presentation. To the extent people want to hang on and I can field some questions, I'd be happy to do so.
We do have a few questions, Mike.
Okay.
If you have a minute or two. I think you've probably, yeah, you've answered a lot of the questions that have come in, but I'm going to throw out two that have occurred a couple of times. If a fund, or for that matter the plan, is delivering strong performance net of fees, isn't that enough?
Yeah, ultimately what matters is what ends up in the participant's pocket. So again, one thing to keep in mind, the DOL never said you have to have the least expensive fees. It just said your fees need to be reasonable. You can choose any investment option you want, and sometimes you're going to have to pay more for options that hopefully will deliver better returns. Where the real focus is making sure that you're not overpaying, so that you understand all the components, what's going towards record keeping and administration. Where do you have opportunities to maybe have that same fund but with a lower expense structure? That's part of the area that the ABB got into problems with, that they weren't looking and taking opportunities of their size as they grew to get the good performing funds at a lower cost. So there are a lot of moving parts to this. So yes, if you've got a good performing fund, I'd argue that it may be worth paying an additional fee to get that excess return.
Okay, and one other question before we shut this down. If you, someone asked, you were on your slide 53 talking about going out to the market to get comparisons. So would you share the incumbent information with others?
What you typically do is all you're sharing for the most part is what is your lineup, and you don't even, to the extent, sometimes you share the actual funds, sometimes you don't, but what's important is the bidding providers know where the money's invested. So they'd like to know, okay, if I've got a large cap blend fund, is it indexed or is it actively managed, and how much money's there? If there's a stable value fund, how much money is in there, so that when they construct a lineup, they'll be able to construct a lineup that's like fund to like fund. So you don't necessarily have to give them specific fund names. There's no harm in doing that. In terms of the cost of the incumbent, no, I wouldn't share that. That's a component of what you're collecting from everybody else and what you're going to use to measure everybody else against. So I wouldn't share expense structure of the existing lineup. All I would share is what are they doing, what are they delivering in terms of service, and what the fund lineup is and where the money's invested. That's all you really need to share.
Okay, we have one last question. I promise this is the last. If you have a third party do your benchmarking for you, is there a fee for that? If so, who pays? Can it be shared with the participants?
Yeah, typically, again, this is, you know, it's work. We do work like this. It's a project. There's a fee associated with the project. The fee for this kind of project is a permissible ERISA plan expense. So let's say you have an ERISA budget, and to the extent there's money that is not being used, you can use some of those fees to pay for a fee benchmarking. Or you can pay for it outside the plan. Or you may end up negotiating a restructure of your contract with your existing provider that creates an ERISA budget, a portion of which can be used to pay for these fees. They are ERISA permissible expenses, but again, you've got an option as a plan sponsor to pay for them with plan assets or with corporate assets.
Okay. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, audience, for logging into today's webinar. We hope to see many of you at our Las Vegas conference, which is in September 9 through 10. Mike is involved in several presentations there, including a pre-conference day-long fiduciary tutorial. Just as a reminder, you'll receive a copy of today's presentation via email, and we'll also be sending out a link to the recording. Again, thank you for attending today's presentation, and have a great day. Bye-bye.